The throttles were already at maximum when Franz Stigler saw them two glints of silver against the pale morning sky over the North Sea. It was February 19th, 1943, and he was leading a swarm of 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109s on what should have been a routine coastal patrol out of Java airfield in northwestern Germany. The radar stations had picked up a formation heading toward Wilhelmshaven, and Stigler's unit had scrambled to intercept. But these aircraft approaching from the west weren't the expected formation of heavy bombers. They were fighters, and their silhouette made Stigler's chest tighten with recognition even before he could make out the details. Twin booms, twin engines. The unmistakable profile that German pilots had begun calling der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What unnerved Stigler wasn't the aircraft's appearance, though its twin-tail configuration was unlike anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. It was something far more troubling, something that violated everything he'd been taught about fighter operations and the natural boundaries of aerial warfare. These American P-38 Lightnings were here, more than 400 miles from the nearest Allied airfield in England, flying with an ease that suggested they had fuel to spare. In the calculus of air combat that Stigler had learned, that should have been impossible. His own 109, already running low after 30 minutes of patrol, would need to turn back toward Germany within minutes or risk going down in the cold waters below. Yet these Americans showed no such concern. They flew as if the North Sea were merely a lake to be crossed, as if the fundamental limitations of physics and fuel capacity that governed every Luftwaffe mission simply didn't apply to them. The engagement that followed was brief and inconclusive. Stigler managed one firing pass before his wingman called out a fuel warning, and the swarm broke off, diving toward the coast with the Lightnings choosing not to pursue. But the encounter left Stigler with a gnawing unease that had nothing to do with enemy marksmanship or aircraft performance in the traditional sense. As he brought his 109 down onto Java's runway 20 minutes later, the engine coughing on fuel vapors, he couldn't stop calculating the distances involved. The Americans had been heading east, toward targets deep in occupied Europe, and they would need to fly all the way back to England when their mission was complete. The numbers didn't make sense according to everything the Luftwaffe knew about fighter aircraft range. A single-engine fighter like the 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190 could barely manage 300 miles of combat radius before fuel became critical. Yet, these Americans were operating at distances that should have been the exclusive domain of bombers. It would take Franz Stigler and thousands of other Luftwaffe pilots months to fully comprehend what they were facing. But the realization, when it came, was devastating in its implications. The fork-tailed devil wasn't terrifying because of its twin engines or its distinctive appearance. It was terrifying because those twin engines enabled something that fundamentally changed the rules of aerial warfare in Europe, a range that extended American fighter cover to targets the Luftwaffe had considered safely beyond reach, a presence that could appear anywhere at any time, and a persistence that turned the vast distances of the European theatre from Germany's strategic advantage into a cage from which there was no escape. In the spring of 1942, when Franz Stigler completed his advanced fighter training at Vernuchen Airfield outside Berlin, the instructors spoke with confidence about the limitations of enemy fighters. The principles were simple and had been proven by 2 years of combat over Europe. British Spitfires and Hurricanes, despite their excellent maneuverability, were fundamentally defensive weapons, tethered to their island by fuel tanks that allowed barely more than an hour of combat flying. When the Luftwaffe had attempted to bomb Britain into submission in 1940 and 41, it was this limitation, the inability of German fighters to escort bombers deep into England, that had contributed to unsustainable losses. Now, the situation is reversed. American and British bombers were attempting to strike targets in occupied Europe and Germany itself, but their escort fighters faced the same tyranny of distance that had plagued the Luftwaffe over Britain. The mathematics were taught to every fighter pilot in training. A Messerschmitt Bf 109E model carried 88 gallons of fuel internally. At normal cruising consumption of roughly 50 gallons per hour, this, provided less than 2 hours of flying time, and combat operations with their throttle adjustments, climbs, and high-power maneuvering consumed fuel far faster. Allowing for takeoff, climb to altitude, reserve for landing, and the fuel-intensive nature of combat itself, a 109 pilot could expect a combat radius of approximately 125 miles under ideal conditions. The 109 F and G models that were entering service in 1942 extended this somewhat, with additional internal fuel capacity and provisions for drop tanks, but even with a disposable 300-litre drop tank, the combat radius barely exceeded 200 miles. These numbers defined the Luftwaffe defensive strategy. Radar stations along the coast provided early warning of approaching Allied bomber formations. Fighter units would scramble, climb to intercept altitude, and engage the bombers during their approach to the target or during their withdrawal. The key tactical consideration was always fuel, calculating whether there was enough to reach the bombers, engage, and return to base with adequate reserve. German pilots learned to think of the map of Europe in terms of fuel zones radiating from their airfields. Beyond certain distances, they simply could not operate effectively. This limitation, however, was considered universal. If German single-engine fighters were constrained by fuel capacity, so too must be Allied fighters. It was an immutable law of aviation. The instructors at Vernuken reinforced this understanding with detailed intelligence briefings. The primary American fighter arriving in Europe in 1942 was the Republic P-37 Thunderbolt, a massive single-engine aircraft that German intelligence described as heavily armed but short-legged. Its size and weight meant prodigious fuel consumption, limiting its effective range to roughly the same distances as German fighters. The Americans also operated the Bell P-39 Airacobra, but this aircraft was considered by both American and German intelligence to be unsuitable for the European theatre and was being diverted to the Soviet Union. Then there was the P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that had begun appearing in small numbers in North Africa and was reportedly being deployed to England. The intelligence assessment of the P-38 that Stigler heard in training was dismissive with qualifications. Yes, it had 2 engines, which theoretically could provide extended range, but twin-engine fighters had proven problematic in combat. They were larger, less maneuverable, and their complexity made them maintenance nightmares in field conditions. The Messerschmitt Bf 1-10, Germany's own twin-engine fighter, had been mauled by single-engine British fighters during the Battle of Britain and was now relegated to night fighting and ground attack roles. The Lockheed P-38 might have decent straight-line speed thanks to its twin Allison engines, but in a turning fight, the instructors assured their students it would be vulnerable to the superior maneuverability of German single-engine fighters. More importantly, the intelligence estimates suggested that even with 2 engines, the P-38's combat radius was only marginally better than single-engine types, perhaps 250 miles at most. These assessments shaped Franz Stigler's understanding of the air war he was entering. When he was posted to Jagdgeschwader 26 in December 1942, he joined a unit that had been savaging Allied bomber formations with relative impunity. The American 8th Air Force had begun daylight bombing operations over occupied France that autumn, sending formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators against targets in France and the Low Countries. The bombers were heavily armed with defensive machine guns, and their tight formations created overlapping fields of fire that made attacks costly. But without fighter escort beyond the French coast, they were ultimately vulnerable. Luftwaffe fighters would wait until the American escorts reached the limit of their fuel and turned back, then attack the now unprotected bombers during the long flight to and from the target. It was a successful strategy, and it created a certain confidence among Luftwaffe pilots. The Americans were brave, there was no question of that. They continued their missions despite brutal losses. Some raids saw 10% or more of the attacking bombers shot down or damaged beyond repair. But courage couldn't overcome physics. As long as American fighters couldn't penetrate deep into occupied Europe, the bomber formations would remain vulnerable during crucial portions of their missions. The Luftwaffe was inflicting unsustainable casualties, and German intelligence predicted that the Americans would be forced to either abandon daylight bombing or accept losses that would cripple their strategic air campaign. Franz Stigler's first kills came in January 1943 during attacks on B-17 formations over northern France. He learned the tactics that had been refined through 2 years of combat, approaching from head-on to avoid the concentrated tail guns, focusing fire on the engines to disable the bombers rather than attempting to destroy them outright, breaking away before committing to an extended stern chase that would expose him to defensive fire. He also learned the rhythm of these missions. The American escorts would appear as the bombers crossed the coast, usually P-47s that would weave above the formation, providing cover. The Luftwaffe fighters would feint and probe, avoiding decisive engagement with the escorts while conserving fuel. Then, at a predictable point, usually somewhere around the French-Belgian border, the P-47s would waggle their wings and turn back toward England, their fuel states no longer permitting them to continue. That was the moment when the real attack would begin, with German fighters falling upon the now unescorted bombers. This pattern held through the winter of 1942–43. Stigler flew dozens of missions against American bomber formations, and the tactical situation remained essentially unchanged. The bombers came in daylight, the escorts accompanied them as far as their fuel allowed, and the Luftwaffe attacked once the escorts departed. It was brutal, calculated warfare, but it operated according to understood rules. Both sides were constrained by the same fundamental limitations of fuel capacity and range. Then, on that February morning over the North Sea, Franz Stigler encountered something that violated those rules. The P-38s he'd seen weren't providing close escort to a bomber formation. They were flying a fighter sweep, ranging far ahead of any bombers, operating at a distance from England that should have left them with barely enough fuel to return home, let alone engage in combat, and they weren't behaving like pilots worried about fuel consumption. They were flying aggressively, actively seeking engagement, as if they had unlimited reserves. When Stigler returned to Jeva and filed his combat report, he mentioned the unusual range at which the engagement had occurred. The intelligence officer noted it with interest, but offered a plausible explanation. Perhaps these particular aircraft had been fitted with additional external fuel tanks that would be jettisoned before combat, or perhaps they were operating from a forward base that intelligence hadn't yet identified. It wasn't impossible, after all, for American fighters to stage through intermediate fields in occupied territory that hadn't been properly prepared. Perhaps they were using captured German airfields in occupied France that had changed hands during rapid ground operations. But over the following weeks, reports began accumulating from across the Luftwaffe's defensive network. P-38s were appearing with increasing frequency at distances that shouldn't have been possible. They were escorting bomber formations not just to the French coast or the Belgian border, but deep into occupied Europe. They were flying fighter sweeps over the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. Most disturbing, they were loitering in areas where German fighters traditionally attacked bombers, their presence extending far beyond the point where single-engine escorts had previously been forced to turn back. In March 1943, Stigler's unit encountered P-38s during a mission against American bombers striking targets near Bremen, more than 300 miles from the nearest confirmed Allied airfield in England. The Lightnings engaged aggressively, and their pilots showed no indication of being concerned about fuel consumption. They pursued German fighters through multiple engagements, and when Stigler's flight finally broke away and dove for the deck, the Americans followed for nearly 50 miles before finally turning back toward the northwest. This was unprecedented. Even if the Americans had drop tanks, the distances involved suggested fuel capacities that were at least double, possibly triple, what single-engine fighters could achieve. The Luftwaffe intelligence staff began compiling detailed assessments of the P-38's actual capabilities, and what emerged painted a far different picture than the dismissive evaluations Stigler had heard in training. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning wasn't simply a twin-engine fighter with marginally better range than single-engine types. It was an aircraft designed from the outset around the concept of extreme range, a fighter that could operate at distances that had previously been the exclusive domain of multi-engine bombers. The basic configuration was deceptively simple. Two Allison V1710 engines, each producing more than 1,000 horsepower, mounted in twin booms that also housed the main landing gear and turbochargers. Between the booms, a central nacelle contained the cockpit, armament, and nose wheel. The initial intelligence had focused on the disadvantages of this layout: the added weight and complexity, the increased radar cross-section, the potential vulnerability of having two engines instead of one. What hadn't been fully appreciated was what this configuration enabled in terms of fuel capacity and efficiency. Each engine drove its own propeller, and each boom contained fuel tanks' internal capacity of 410 gallons, more than 4 times what a Messerschmitt 109 carried. This alone would have provided respectable range, but the P-38 had been designed with provisions for external fuel tanks mounted under the wings. Early models operated with 150-gallon drop tanks, but newer variants arriving in Europe were equipped with 300-gallon drop tanks, one under each wing. With maximum external fuel, a P-38 Lightning could carry more than 1,000 gallons of fuel, roughly 12 times the internal capacity of a German single-engine fighter. The implications cascaded through German tactical planning like a shockwave through water. With internal fuel alone, the P-38 had a combat radius of approximately 450 miles, already far exceeding any single-engine fighter. With 300-gallon drop tanks, this extended to approximately 650 miles in a combat configuration, allowing for climb, combat maneuvering, and adequate reserve. But in a pure ferry configuration, with disciplined fuel management and minimal combat time, the P-38 could fly more than 1,300 miles from base, engage targets, and return. This meant that there was effectively nowhere in occupied Western Europe or northwestern Germany that was beyond the reach of American fighter escort. Franz Stigler began to understand what he and the entire Luftwaffe were facing during a mission in April 1943. His unit scrambled to intercept a bomber formation targeting industrial facilities in the Ruhr Valley. This was deep German territory, more than 400 miles from England by the most direct route, and well beyond the range where Allied fighters had previously been able to provide escort. Yet when Stigler's Schwarmer reached intercept altitude, climbing through 18,000 feet southwest of Essen, the bombers were already accompanied by P-38s. The American fighters were positioned in a combat spread above and to the sides of the bomber formation, and their pilots clearly had sufficient fuel to actively patrol rather than simply flying straight and level to conserve consumption. The tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Previously, Luftwaffe fighters could choose when and where to engage, waiting until Allied escorts departed before committing to attack. Now, the presence of long-range escort meant that bomber formations had fighter protection throughout their entire mission profile during approach to target, over the target itself, and during withdrawal. German fighters couldn't simply wait for a vulnerable moment because that moment no longer existed in the systematic way it had before. Every attack on bombers now meant fighting through the escort fighters first, and doing so while managing fuel constraints that the Americans no longer shared to the same degree. Stigler's Schwarm attempted to work around to the sun side of the formation, hoping to use altitude and position to offset the numerical disadvantage. But the P-38s reacted smoothly, several breaking away from the main formation to climb and intercept the German fighters before they could position for an attack run. What followed was a running engagement that lasted nearly 20 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat, where most fighter engagements resolved in seconds or minutes. The P-38s couldn't turn with the more nimble 109s, but they didn't need to. They used their superior speed in level flight and dive to dictate engagement distance, attacking when they had advantage and disengaging when the situation became unfavorable. More critically, they showed no concern about fuel expenditure. They could afford to pursue, to climb back to altitude after diving attacks, to remain engaged for extended periods. Stigler, by contrast, was acutely aware of his fuel gauge throughout the engagement. He'd already burned through his external drop tank during the climb to altitude. His main internal tanks were being consumed steadily by high-power maneuvering. 15 minutes into the engagement, he had to make the calculation that every Luftwaffe pilot dreaded whether he had enough fuel remaining to continue fighting and still return to base with adequate reserve, or whether he needed to break off while he still had options. At 18 minutes, with his fuel warning light beginning to flicker, he called for his flight to disengage. They dove away toward the east, and the P-38s, rather than pursuing immediately, took the time to climb back to formation altitude before resuming escort duties. They had fuel to spare for the climb. Stigler barely made it back to his field with minimal reserve. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound. For 2 years, Luftwaffe pilots had operated with the confidence that came from understanding the battlefield's boundaries. They knew how far they could go, how long they could fight, and they knew that the enemy faced the same constraints. The P-38 shattered that understanding. German pilots now had to consider that at any point in occupied Europe, they might encounter American fighters operating with fuel reserves that allowed extended combat. The Americans could chase. They could climb back to altitude. They could remain in an area and patrol. They could afford tactical decisions that would have been suicide for fuel-limited German pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The nickname that German pilots had given the aircraft, der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, had initially been about its appearance, that distinctive twin-boom silhouette that was unlike anything in the European theatre. But as spring turned to summer in 1943, the nickname took on a darker meaning. The devil wasn't the shape. The devil was what that shape enabled. The twin engines that powered those distinctive booms gave the P-38 something that fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the air war, the ability to go anywhere, at any time, and to stay there long enough to matter. By May 1943, the Luftwaffe High Command could no longer dismiss the P-38's operational range as an anomaly or the result of favourable conditions. Intelligence officers had collected dozens of encounter reports from across occupied Europe, and when the data was compiled and analysed, a disturbing pattern emerged. American fighters were regularly appearing at distances of 400 to 500 miles from their bases in England. More concerning, they were doing so with sufficient fuel reserves to conduct combat operations for 30 to 40 minutes before returning home. The mathematics were undeniable. The fork-tailed devil had effectively extended American fighter cover to include targets that German strategic planning had assumed would remain beyond reach throughout the war. The Luftwaffe's response was to attempt replicating this capability with their own aircraft. The Messerschmitt 109G variant was modified to accept a 300-litre external drop tank under the fuselage centerline, and in theory, this extended its combat radius to approximately 230 miles, but the reality of operational use revealed critical differences. The drop tank was disposable, jettisoned before combat to reduce drag and weight, which meant that German pilots still had to carefully manage their internal fuel during the return flight. The P-38 pilots, by contrast, could jettison their external tanks and still have 410 gallons of internal fuel, remaining more than enough to fight their way home if necessary. Moreover, the drop tank installation on the 109 came with penalties. The additional weight and drag reduced climb performance and maneuverability, and the tank itself had to be manufactured, transported to frontline units, and properly maintained. German industrial capacity was already strained by 1943, and producing disposable fuel tanks in the quantities needed to equip every fighter sortie was a significant burden. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing P-38s in numbers that seemed to multiply weekly. Lockheed's factories in Burbank, California, were delivering aircraft at a rate the Luftwaffe intelligence staff initially refused to believe. More than 500 P-38s were manufactured in the first half of 1943 alone, and production was accelerating. Franz Stigler experienced the cumulative weight of these developments through the summer of 1943 in a series of missions that gradually eroded the tactical certainty he'd felt just months earlier. In June, his unit intercepted a bomber formation, striking targets in the Rhineland. The bombers were escorted by both P-47s and P-38s, and the American fighters had worked out a relay system. The P-47s, with their shorter range, would escort the bombers from England to the German border, then turn back. But instead of leaving the bombers unprotected, P-38s that had been flying high cover would descend to take over close escort duties, remaining with the bombers all the way to the target and back to the coast. The handoff was smooth and coordinated, and it meant that there was never a moment when the bombers lacked fighter protection. In July, Stigler witnessed something that crystallized just how thoroughly the operational paradigm had shifted. His shawarma was vectored to intercept a small formation of 4 P-38s that radar had detected flying deep into German airspace without any accompanying bombers. This was a pure fighter sweep, the Americans sending fighters ahead to clear the skies and engage any defending aircraft they encountered. The tactic was called fighter ramrod, and it represented a level of confidence that would have been unthinkable for the Luftwaffe over England 3 years earlier. You didn't send fighters on independent sweeps hundreds of miles into enemy territory unless you were absolutely certain they could reach their patrol areas, engage effectively, and return home safely. The engagement itself lasted less than 5 minutes. Stigler's flight had the altitude advantage and dove on the American formation from the sun side. But the P-38 pilots reacted with practiced coordination, 2 breaking left while 2 broke right, forcing the German fighters to split their attack. In the turning fight that followed, Stigler managed to line up a firing pass on one Lightning, his cannon shells sparking off the aircraft's left boom. But the P-38 pilot simply pushed the throttles forward and dove away, using superior speed to break contact. Stigler followed, but the Lightning was pulling away despite his 109 being in a power dive. At 12,000 feet, with his airspeed indicator showing 600 kilometers per hour, the gap had widened to nearly a kilometer. The American fighter leveled out, climbed back to altitude, and rejoined his formation. They hadn't shot down any German fighters, but they hadn't lost any aircraft either, and they demonstrated complete control over when and how the engagement occurred. What Stigler found most unsettling wasn't the combat performance. The P-38's straight-line speed and dive capability were already well documented. It was the casual nature of the entire mission. These American pilots had flown 400 miles into hostile airspace, engaged enemy fighters, and were now flying back to England as if it were nothing more than a training exercise. They had fuel to spare for mistakes, for extended maneuvering, for going around again if the first attack didn't work. They could afford to be patient and methodical in ways that German pilots, always conscious of their fuel states, could not. The 8th Air Force exploited this advantage with increasing sophistication as summer progressed toward autumn. American mission planners began launching multiple bomber formations simultaneously, striking targets across occupied Europe and Germany. The P-38s would provide escort to the deepest penetrating raids, while shorter-ranged P-47s covered formations hitting targets in France and the Low Countries. Luftwaffe controllers faced an impossible dilemma. They had to vector limited fighter resources against multiple threats, and regardless of which bomber formation they chose to engage, they would be facing fighter escort. The days of waiting for escorts to depart and then attacking vulnerable bombers had ended. By August 1943, Franz Stigler had logged more than 60 combat missions, and he'd seen enough engagements with P-38s to understand that something fundamental had broken in the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. It wasn't that individual German pilots couldn't compete in combat. The 109 was still a formidable fighter, and experienced pilots like Stigler had learned the P-38's weaknesses. In a turning fight at low speed, the Lightning was vulnerable. Its large size and heavy weight made it less agile than German single-engine fighters. But increasingly, combat didn't occur on terms that allowed German pilots to exploit these advantages. The Americans could choose when to fight and when to disengage. They could afford to make mistakes because they had the fuel to recover from them. They operated with a margin of error that the Luftwaffe had lost. The psychological toll was insidious. Every mission now involved complex fuel calculations that added another layer of stress to an already dangerous profession. Stigler found himself constantly aware of his fuel gauge, constantly doing mental arithmetic about consumption rates and distance to base. Would there be enough fuel to pursue if an opportunity presented itself? Could he afford to climb back to altitude after a diving attack? How long could he remain in the combat area before he absolutely had to turn back? These calculations crowded his thinking during engagements, creating hesitation and doubt at moments when decisiveness was essential. And always, in the back of his mind, was the knowledge that the American pilots didn't have to think this way. They had range to burn. They could make choices based purely on tactical considerations, without fuel being the primary constraint. It was an advantage that compounded through every phase of every mission. An advantage in positioning, in persistence, in the simple ability to stay and fight, rather than constantly calculating whether it was time to run for home. The broader impact on Luftwaffe operations became evident through the late summer and autumn of 1943. Bomber losses for the 8th Air Force, while still significant, were noticeably lower on missions where P-38s provided escort throughout the entire route. The Americans were reaching targets deeper in Germany, targets that had been considered safe from daylight bombing because they were beyond fighter escort range. In August, bombers struck Regensburg and Schweinfurt, both deep in southern Germany. The Schweinfurt raid in particular was costly, 60 bombers lost out of 230 dispatched. But significantly, the raid had reached its target and inflicted substantial damage despite being well beyond what had been considered the operational limit of American fighter range. P-38s hadn't escorted that particular mission due to their limited numbers and the extreme distance involved, but their presence on other raids was freeing up resources and changing American calculations about what was operationally feasible. By October, the 8th Air Force was routinely conducting missions to targets 300 to 400 miles inside occupied Europe, and P-38s were providing coverage for significant portions of these raids. The Lightnings were now operating in groups of 20 to 40 aircraft, not just the small flights of 4 to 6 that had appeared in early engagements. Their pilots had refined tactics specifically for escort duty, flying high above the bomber formations to maintain energy advantage, diving to engage any German fighters that attempted to attack the bombers, then climbing back to altitude rather than pursuing German fighters into low-altitude turning fights, where the P-38's weaknesses would be exposed. Franz Stigler's understanding of what he was fighting shifted from tactical to strategic during these months. Individual engagements were one thing you could win or lose, a particular combat based on skill, positioning, and luck. But the accumulated weight of dozens of missions made clear that the P-38 represented something larger than just another enemy fighter type. It represented a solution to what had been the fundamental problem of strategic bombing: how to protect deep-penetration bomber raids from defending fighters. The Americans had solved it not through superior dogfighting capability, but through range. They'd built a fighter that could simply go farther than anything else in the sky, and that extra range was worth more than maneuverability or climb rate or any other performance metric. In November 1943, Stigler's unit was withdrawn from frontline operations for rest and refit after months of continuous combat. He'd survived longer than most. The attrition rate among Luftwaffe day fighter pilots was approaching 50% per year by this point. During the brief respite, he had time to reflect on how completely the air war had changed since he'd first engaged P-38s over the North Sea 9 months earlier. The confident predictions that the Americans would be forced to abandon daylight bombing due to unsustainable losses had proven false. Instead, it was the Luftwaffe that was being ground down, losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced, facing an enemy that had solved the range problem that German strategists had assumed was unsolvable. The fork-tailed Devil's real weapon wasn't its guns, though it carried 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in its nose with devastating effect. The weapon was time and distance. The P-38 could stay in the fight when other aircraft had to leave. It could reach places other fighters couldn't protect. And in doing so, it broke the mathematical certainty that had defined aerial warfare since the beginning of the conflict. Franz Stigler had been taught that physics imposed hard limits on what was possible in combat aviation. The P-38 hadn't violated physics. It had simply been designed from the beginning with different priorities, built around range as the primary metric rather than treating it as a secondary consideration. When Stigler returned to operations in December 1943, the situation had deteriorated further. American bomber formations were larger, their tactics more refined, and the P-38 presence had multiplied. The 8th Air Force now had multiple fighter groups equipped with Lightnings, and they were coordinating their operations with devastating efficiency. German pilots were being forced to develop entirely new tactics centered around avoiding engagement with escorts rather than fighting through them to reach the bombers. The guidance from senior commanders was increasingly defensive: preserve the fighter force, avoid unnecessary combat with American fighters, and strike the bombers only when clear opportunities presented themselves. This represented a complete inversion of fighter doctrine. Fighters were supposed to seek combat, to aggressively engage enemy aircraft and establish air superiority. But the Luftwaffe no longer had the resources or the operational advantage to fight that way over occupied Europe. The initiative had shifted to the Americans, who could choose where and when to commit their forces, confident that their fighters had the range to support whatever operations their bombers conducted. In January 1944, Franz Stigler witnessed what he would later consider the definitive proof of how completely the strategic situation had shifted. A massive American raid targeted aircraft manufacturing facilities in central Germany, with more than 600 bombers dispatched against multiple targets. The raid penetrated nearly 500 miles into German territory, and P-38s escorted portions of the formation throughout the entire mission profile. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything available, throwing more than 400 fighters against the bomber stream. The resulting air battle sprawled across hundreds of miles of airspace, with engagements from the Dutch coast all the way to targets near Leipzig and back. Stigler's unit engaged a bomber formation over Brunswick, and the P-38s providing escort fought with a confidence and aggressiveness that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. They weren't fighting defensively, trying to conserve fuel and position for a long flight home. They were hunting, actively pursuing German fighters and forcing them to break off attacks before they could reach the bombers. The engagement lasted nearly 40 minutes longer than most Luftwaffe pilots could remain in the combat area without critically depleting their fuel reserves. Stigler watched American fighters that had been hit, trailing smoke or flying with visible damage, simply light out for England on one engine, secure in the knowledge that even damaged, they had the range to make it home. German pilots hit by the same kind of battle damage had to make impossible calculations about whether to bail out over friendly territory or attempt an emergency landing with questionable odds of success. The raid was costly for the Americans. More than 60 bombers were lost, along with several fighters. But the bombers had reached their targets, dropped their ordnance, and the majority had returned to England. More significantly, the raid demonstrated that there was effectively nowhere in Germany that was beyond the reach of American air power when they were willing to commit the resources. The P-38 had extended the bomber offensive's reach to include the entire country, and German industrial capacity, already strained by 3 years of total war, was now vulnerable to systematic attack in a way that British night bombing alone had never achieved. By spring of 1944, the arrival of even longer-ranged American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang with its drop tanks and efficient engine, meant that the P-38's role was beginning to shift. The Mustang could match or exceed the Lightning's range while offering superior high-altitude performance. But for Franz Stigler and thousands of other Luftwaffe pilots, the P-38 had already accomplished its strategic purpose. It had bought time during the critical pilot period of 1943 when American bombers desperately needed extended escort and no other fighter could provide it. It had proven that the range problem could be solved, changing operational planning on both sides. And it had imposed a psychological toll on German pilots who'd been forced to confront the reality that their own tactical and operational limitations weren't shared by the enemy. Stigler survived the war barely. He was shot down twice more, once by P-38s over France in June 1944 and once by Spitfires during the desperate last months of the war. He ended the conflict with 28 confirmed victories, a survivor of more than 400 combat missions. After the war, during the long years of rebuilding, he would occasionally encounter American pilots at aviation events and reunions. Some of them had flown P-38s over Europe, and they would trade stories with the casual camaraderie of old soldiers who'd fought on opposite sides of a concluded conflict. In those conversations, Stigler learned details about the P-38 that intelligence briefings during the war had never captured. He learned that American pilots had called it the Lightning, but also less flattering nicknames. Some complained about its cockpit heating problems at altitude, others about the complexity of managing two engines and the risk of asymmetric engine failure. He learned that it had been expensive and difficult to manufacture, that Lockheed had struggled with production bottlenecks, and that many American pilots had preferred the later war P-51 Mustang for its simpler operation and better high-altitude handling. But he also learned that P-38 pilots had loved the aircraft for one quality above all others, the feeling of security that came from knowing they could reach anywhere in Europe and still have fuel to get home. For American fighter pilots in 1943 and early 1944, the post-Tarman AHET Lightning represented freedom from the constant fuel anxiety that had plagued earlier escort missions. They could focus on the tactical situation without mental arithmetic about consumption rates and distance to base dominating their decision-making. It was, several pilots told him, like fighting without a clock ticking in your head, a liberation that was worth every pound of extra weight and every minute of added maintenance complexity. To Franz Stigler, listening to these American pilots decades after the war, this crystallized something he'd understood instinctively during those desperate months of 1943, but had never articulated clearly. The P-38's fork-tailed configuration, so distinctive and initially so puzzling to German intelligence, had been the visible manifestation of a fundamentally different design philosophy. Lockheed had built an aircraft where range wasn't a constraint to be minimized, but a capability to be maximized, even at the cost of other performance attributes. They'd understood that in a strategic air war fought across the vast distances of Europe, the ability to be present mattered more than the ability to turn tightly or climb quickly. Presence was its own form of power. The nickname fork-tailed devil had started as a description of appearance, evolved into a reference to the aircraft's combat capabilities, but ultimately came to represent something more profound, the realization that American aviation had approached the fundamental problems of air warfare with different assumptions than German engineering. While the Luftwaffe had optimized for performance metrics that mattered in short-range tactical combat, the Americans had built for strategic reach. They'd asked not, how do we build the most maneuverable fighter, but how do we build a fighter that can protect bombers anywhere in Europe? The answers to those questions produced very different aircraft. In the calculus of total war, the P-38's twin engines and distinctive silhouette had purchased something invaluable, the ability to project fighter cover across distances that transformed strategic bombing from a theoretical capability into a practical reality. It had arrived in Europe when the 8th Air Force desperately needed extended escort, and no other aircraft could provide it. And in doing so, it had helped break the back of German day fighter defenses during the critical year when the outcome of the air war over Europe hung in balance. Franz Stigler would tell younger Germans in the decades after the war that there were many reasons why the Luftwaffe lost air superiority over Europe, overwhelming Allied numerical superiority, the destruction of German pilot training infrastructure, fuel shortages, the increasing sophistication of American bomber defensive tactics, and later the arrival of even longer-ranged fighters like the P-51. But the P-38, he would say, was the aircraft that first broke the illusion that physics and distance provided natural protection for German industry. It was the aircraft that taught him and every other Luftwaffe pilot that the Americans could reach anywhere at any time. And once that lesson was learned, once that psychological certainty about safe distances had been shattered, the air war became a matter of mathematics and industrial capacity, a contest that Germany had no realistic chance of winning. The fork-tailed devil's legacy wasn't measured primarily in kill ratios or combat victories, though P-38 pilots claimed more than 1,800 enemy aircraft destroyed during the war. Its legacy was strategic, the extension of American air power to targets previously beyond reach, the protection of thousands of bomber crew members who would otherwise have faced unescorted missions deep into hostile territory, and the psychological impact on an enemy who had built their defensive strategy on assumptions about range limitations that, suddenly, no longer applied. In a war where distance and logistics often mattered more than tactical brilliance, the aircraft that could fly 1,300 miles and return had proven to be one of the most consequential weapons in the Allied arsenal. The twin booms, the twin engines, the distinctive profile that German pilots had learned to fear, it had all served a single purpose: to be there when it mattered, to stay when others had to leave, to extend protection across distances that had previously been unbridgeable, and in doing so, to fundamentally alter the rules of aerial warfare over Europe and help pave the way for the Allied strategic bombing campaign that would eventually cripple German industrial capacity and contribute significantly to the Third Reich's defeat. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.